So chapter 1 starts by introducing us to a bunch of different mythologies that we tend to believe as Americans, meaning most of them simply aren't true. The title of the chapter is American Paradox for a reason, because we talk about several different ironies in terms of culture, conflict, and contradiction. The subheading is called Operation Varsity Blues, and for those of you who haven't seen the 1999 flick, it has a lot to do with football, but also the cheating and insidious nature of athletics and how pervasive it tends to be within the educational system itself. If you are any type of athletic sports guru, you hear of these sort of scandals all the time. One of the favorites that I like to bring up has to deal with Derrick Rose, who was accused of not taking his own ACT and going to Memphis. You have a lot of cheating in college athletics because they're required. Men, in particular, right, are required to go to college for, a set period of time, whether that be a year, 2 years, or more, before they can get drafted. So it sort of makes college athletics a business, in retrospect, retroactively. So Operation Varsity Blues is pulling from the metaphor, this athletic metaphor we have for cheating, scandal, and exceptions for those who are athletically exceptional in American society. And it actually opens up with a recent scandal. I think it says, 19. We learned as a society that there were people of the upper crust, the upper echelons of society that were paying for access. And what I mean by that is this. They were paying for test scores to be altered. They were paying for scholarships that should have been saved for other people. They were, as the text puts it, illicitly gaining admission to some of the school's top universities because they were paying for it, because they had the money to bribe people to put their kids in some of these schools. So, the alleged means employed include bribery, standardized test-making manipulation, bogus athletics recruitments, and outright cheating. There were 2, I think, high-ranked television stars that were found, or that pleaded guilty eventually to this type of ploy, and several other high-ranking business members also. However, here's the important thing. I'm going to read this section to you. It's on the bottom of 67. The true victims of the scandal were the American people, who were rudely awakened to a contradiction that has always lain in the heart of the American dream, and that they had often denied, myself included. America's promise of a level playing field for all who seek success through hard work and personal merit simply isn't true, because there are people that cheat and subvert the system. At a time when economic inequality in America had risen to levels not seen since the Gilded Age, and when the economic recovery from the Great Recession had benefited only a small fraction of the population, the shockwave caused by the admissions scandal was entirely understandable. So, I've always known that if you go to college, there's a tier, or there are tiers, I should say, in terms of access. If you go to Harvard and graduate, that is considered a higher tier, that is considered more prestigious than, let's just say, my state school education. All of my state school education combined. And why is that? Because Harvard costs tens of thousands of dollars more a year than I paid for my public school university education. And by going to Harvard and paying that sticker price, that person is paying for access to a better job, which usually equates to a better life, per se. in terms of economic stability. American exceptionalism is the notion, the mythology, that America has found a way to deal with class inadequacies, class differences. And when I say mythology, it means it truly isn't true. We have an economic and social strata in this country, low, middle, and upper class, that has yet to be resolved. Now, please do not confuse this with some sort of communist agenda or manifesto. You just cannot deny that there are different classes in society, because there are. And so chapter 1 starts you off with this paradox, because the authors, the editors, want you to know and believe that even though we are all told, all American children are told, you can be whatever you want to be, do whatever you want to do when you grow up, as long as you work hard, that's not true. It just isn't true. 68, middle of the page, an example of American exceptionalism is the belief that constitutes one of America's most fundamental mythologies, and like all mythologies, it is contradicted again and again in our everyday lives. So this chapter is designed to alert you to those contradictions and inadequacies, and while it may be true maybe a lot of the time, maybe most of the time, for you or for other people that you know, it may not be the same thing, same case for other individuals. And even when I say a lot or most of the time, it's not all of the time. It just isn't. So there are 6 contradictions on the bottom of 68 that I want you to pause and read. Pause now. Okay, we're back. America's contradictory history of religious spiritualism alongside capitalist materialism. This is outlined on pages 69 and 70, and even, I'm sorry, 69, and briefly on the top of 70. And the one example that they give you is this notion that we have these certain spiritual holidays that are supposed to remind us of our sort of religious implications. If we have religion, you may not have religion at all, and that's okay. And, you know, in part, we do those things, right? If you celebrate Christmas, there are certain fundamental religious beliefs you have that are associated with Christmas. If you celebrate Hanukkah, there's certain religious beliefs that you have about that holiday. Kwanzaa, right? Festivus is not really spiritually aligned, but perhaps, you know, you're a family that spiritually aligns Festivus. But what happens then, right, is capitalism has sort of stepped in and said, okay, in order to celebrate this holiday effectively, you have to buy things. I mean, just as an oversimplification, right? You have to buy things. And probably for the majority of Americans, that's true. So capitalism has sort of stepped into a religious space and commodified it, right? That's what this is talking about here. 2, America's contradictory history of puritanical sexual repression alongside sexual commodification. So this actually happened to me quite recently. I had a student who said, I don't agree with breastfeeding in public. I think it's repulsive, outrageous, everything, right in the book. But I think it's okay that the Kardashians get on magazine covers and pose nude because they're making money. What is the problem with this example? According to this student, putting your body on display for the rest of the world to see is okay as long as the woman is desirable and as long as she's making money, right? So it would seem. So a woman who is breastfeeding in public, who may be covered up, may or may not be covered up, that's not okay. That's disgusting. Why? Is it because she's not making money? And, you know, in that act? I'm not sure. I don't think I've yet to this day been able to figure out why that juxtaposition exists for this person. But there's definitely a conflict there, right? As long as we can commodify sex and it sells, cool, right? As long as we can make money off of it, cool. If we can't, then other forms of sexuality on display are grotesque. I mean, just consider, let's just say a woman, okay, not a child. I know the book example talks about toddlers for tiaras, which takes me back to the Bonet case of my youth. But let's just take an everyday example. Let's say you have a woman. Let's say she's 25 years old, and she's revealing something that maybe she's wearing something that people may consider too revealing. A lot of people, including other women, would probably talk about her around her. Look at what that woman is wearing. That's indecent, this, that, and the other thing. That woman then went and did a photo shoot for Vogue, or I don't know, right? Then she's beautiful, right? That's okay because she's making money. Now I know not a lot of people may make those same connections and may think it's vulgar on both counts, and if so, at least you're on the same page, right, with both. But if you're sitting there wondering the same thing, and then you're gonna have all these people that make exceptions, right? Well, she's too big to be wearing that. She's too young to be wearing that. She's too whatever to be wearing that in public. If you put that woman, a toddler, into a contest, it's okay because it's a contest based on beauty. There are things to win. There's some sort of social and cultural merit that comes from her winning that contest. But if you put that toddler in society dressed the same way, there are often violent implications. I mean, there was a young girl, the last name was Bonet, I believe, when I was that I think the case has yet to be solved. I was murdered, and seemingly because of this hyper-sexualization, over-sexualization of a toddler. So, this is a contradiction in ideology, right? The book says here, at least in terms of toddlers and tiaras, in the midst of this conflict between two sexual ideologies, the one oppressive and the other expressive, we can find the paradoxical existence of such TV programs, like Toddlers and Tiaras, which offers a striking example of just how tangled up America's contradictions can become, because the core audience for such pageants, which blatantly sexualize little girls, tend to be dominated by family-oriented women who would otherwise disapprove of the public display of human sexuality. Three, America's contradictory history of self-reliant individualism along mass cultural consumerist conformism. I'm not exactly a fan of the Pokemon example, but let me put it to you in other terms. So for a long time, in the 1950s and 1960s, well, it's just in the 50s, the popular garb were slacks, okay? Jeans came about as sort of this like counterculture revolution. They were a symbol of, I'm not wearing slacks anymore, I'm not wearing dresses anymore, I'm not wearing heels, I'm not wearing a tie. I'm going to wear jeans, a t-shirt, whatever the heck I want, because you can't tell me what to do with my body. So jeans were not mass-produced until really around the 1960s and the countercultural revolution. And it became an emblem of rebellion. But what did jean companies do when they found out that this was sort of, an emerging garment of youngsters? They started to mass produce them. And the mass production of that, which is supposed to be, heavily symbolic of individualism, became a part of mass consumer society. And there isn't anyone watching this video right now that probably doesn't at least own one pair of jeans. But if you don't, I'm still aware of the fact that there could be someone watching this that doesn't own a pair of jeans, but the chances are very small. They also, of course, then co-opted mass consumer society, and companies co-opted the peace sign as well, which used to just be sewn onto jeans. Then jean companies would manufacture them on the jeans, or they'd put them on bags, or they'd put them on hats and sell them. So something that was supposed to be, right, an emblem of rebellion becomes mainstream. And it loses its luster, loses its importance. It certainly has with jeans and with the peace sign. America's contradictory history of egalitarian populism alongside socioeconomic elitism. So, best way I can explain this contradiction to you is this: before a recent president took office, at least in modern history, most presidents this is still true though, most presidents had an Ivy League background. Most were affluent. If you look at the people that serve us in Congress, people that have been president, they have all come from affluent backgrounds. If they were not born affluent, they became affluent before they became president. You have a lot of people in Congress that fit that bill too, right? So why? And the text gives an example of DT, but he was never by any means poor. People also, let's just say on the other side, tend to look, to someone like Bernie Sanders as running on sort of this populist agenda as well. Bernie, when he was younger, probably came from, means that were questionable, but by the time he would have been elected president, if he had, earned the nomination and had won, would have been, and is right now, affluent, right? So why do we believe that somebody who is affluent knows what it's like to be us? I mean, you also have this contradiction in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. But we have to acknowledge, and this goes back to something I said before, that permanent class inequality exists in this country. Permanent class inequality exists in this country. Period. And you'll say, well, those people can escape that and this and that, and there'll be all kinds of different excuses that people make about class inequality. And while those may be true, there's still class inequality. There's still going to be people that live below the poverty line. There's still going to be people that live on the streets for whatever reason. There's still going to be people that can't escape middle class. And not because of lack of effort and hard work. It's just the way that it is. So, and class inequality, you cannot talk about class inequality without looking at social and racial issues as well. And so that's your chapter sort of talks about that as well. The other one, and this segues into the personal liberty alongside chattel slavery and its legacy. There are racial reverberations in this country that have yet to be discussed. I think at least on a grandiose level, you can't, like I said, you can't talk about economic divisions without talking about racial divisions as well. Because when you have groups, racial and ethnic groups, that were oppressed by the patriarchy centuries ago and were held down until maybe recently, or are still being held down, there's no way that they're going to make strides economically at the rate that other people are. To give you an example, I am of Irish ancestry, and for a long time, the Irish were oppressed. But over the course of several hundred years, we have integrated in society and have sort of risen the social and economic ladders. However, our race, for the most part, wasn't a hindrance. So after a while, we kind of blended in. Whereas other people don't necessarily have those same opportunities. And those things, all of the data suggests that those things hold them back. I mean, just take the historical event of African American slavery in this country. When you've enslaved one portion of the population for a very long time, while other races and ethnicities are out there working and making money and acquiring generational wealth, certainly once they're freed, they're behind the 8 ball, right? So that's the other contradiction that we don't like to deal with. And the last is the contradictory history as a land of immigrants alongside anti-immigration nativism. And unless you're sitting here listening and you're indigenous, your family, you come from a family of immigrants. I am not indigenous. As far as I know, there are no members of my family that are indigenous. Irish, English, which we tend to erase from our conversations, French, German. I'm an immigrant. This country tends to be highly critical of how to allow immigrants into the country, what policies should follow those people, and we tend to say, well, this is our country, and we should be able to decide who comes in and who comes out. And I agree. We argue though over how that should be done, and with the birth rate going down anyway, we're going to need immigrants for the workforce to help support social systems like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. So it's interesting how we talk about immigration based on our history as a country. And so the chapter outlines these 6 contradictions. And so at this point, the last subheading is, what's red and blue and mad all over? Of course, the answer is America. And there are a variety of reasons for that. This hyper-political and highly sensitive culture that we live in needs to be navigated for us right now. You may, after 2 lectures, be wondering why we're talking about these topics, and I receive a lot of scrutiny for them, but it is important in an introductory course like a writing course to write about things that actually matter and not about topics that don't matter. So I choose this textbook along with several of my colleagues in the English department for that reason, because I think it's important to have these conversations, because heavens, I know that there are a lot of our authority figures in this country, whether they be parents, guardians, congressmen, politicians, who can't have these conversations respectfully. And it's important for the next generation to acquire that skill. So, get ready.